In the last episode, I showed how every accusation about the issue of beatings in the Old Testament was over-exaggerated projectionism, and that any honest reading of the texts concerning this topic would conclude that the Bible is teaching ethics very comparable to the way certain institutions of the modern West continue their practices even today. I want to spend a little more time fleshing out some of these ideas so that the listener can be well acquainted with these verses before moving on to other verses we find in the New Testament. We learned in the last episode how Matt Dillahunty and other atheists like him actually have no objection to slavery in principle, only that they have objections to the idea of referring to any human as property. Matt failed to define what property actually means when referring to a person, and so pumps into his objections undefined, unspoken emotionalism in order to sway ill-informed audiences through buzzwords trapped in historical baggage. Alex O'Connor put it more explicitly when he stated that being property means anyone who owns the property can do whatever they want with it. No holds bar. This definition, he conjectured, is never once ever taught in the Bible and is actually forbidden in the Bible for both items termed as free and as property. So this also was a pathetic attempt to straw man an argument on the Bible that the Bible never actually makes. Let's look at the verse in question. When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be punished, for the slave is his money. This verse comes right on the heels of other laws that teach just compensation in bouts of physical quarreling, and this law applies that same principle to the slave if he should die under the hand of a ruthless overseer. But the law here teaches that if the slave survives, then it would be unfair to presume the intent to kill upon the slave master. The reason it would be unfair to presume this is established by the phrase, because the slave is his money. In other words, the very fact that the master has a financial and vested interest in his slave should presume innocence prima facie to the master before casting aspersions without warrant. The law says this presumption of innocence should be maintained if the slave doesn't die within a day or two, which is an approximate timeline to give the elders enough room to judge each case individually so as to determine the cause of death if the slave should die. And if it's determined that the slave died due to injuries from the master, then due punishment is observed according to all the laws leading up to the statute. However, just because the slave dies happenstance after receiving disciplinary actions, it should not be assumed that the slave master is at fault, because there may be other factors in play that actually caused the death of the slave, and this would be discovered upon further investigation by the court handling such cases. Far from being a draconian law, this law of God actually establishes the principle of innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. And it does this thousands of years earlier than when the Western USA was able to figure it out to codify into their own laws. And based on this verse, you can see that Matt Dillahunty himself agrees that that is how this verse is understood, both in how it was written and read by the people of Israel. Hostile arguments that claim that so-called merciless beatings were limited when in reference to Hebrew slaves, but that foreign slaves were allowed to be beaten mercilessly, those claims, they're spurious and ignorant, having no textual basis at all. Leviticus 25 has already been addressed in the second episode, and the equal treatment of slave and free, aka Hebrew and sojourner, has been established in episode 4 as well as verses that establish this equal treatment without regard to ethnic differences, but rather to only discriminate based on the moral standings of the parties in each case. Every argument trying to say otherwise always relies on things that they can't find in the Bible, which means it's based on things they're making up in their heads. If you had any doubt about the principle of equal treatment under the law for both slave and free in Israel, Let me quote some more verses for you, repeated throughout the law of Moses, that concretely establish this principle beyond the verses that I've already quoted throughout the series. Exodus 12:49. There shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you. Leviticus 24, verse 22. You shall have one law for the sojourner and for the native, for I am the Lord your God. Numbers 15, verses 15 and 16. There shall be one statute for you and for the stranger who sojourns with you, a statute forever throughout your generations. As you are, so shall the sojourner be before the Lord. One law and one ordinance shall be for you and for the stranger who sojourns with you. Since the verses in Leviticus 25 have been addressed in episode 2, let's look at another verse that appears to make a distinction between Hebrew and foreigner. It's Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 10. You may charge a foreigner interest, but you may not charge your brother interest, that the Lord your God may bless you in all that you undertake in the land, that you are entering to take possession of it. Here, in Deuteronomy 23, the verse allows for interest to be charged on foreigners, but not on Israeli brethren. And this verse absolutely does have something to do with slavery, because charging interest is intrinsically connected to debt. And biblical slavery, as we've already discussed, was all about debt. The kind of slavery Israel enacted differed from person to person based on if they were in moral debt for crimes of evil or based on financial debt for poor handling of money. And the Sabbath year laws, as well as the year of Jubilee, allowed for forgiveness of debts to those people who were guilty of financial debt so that they could start anew. But moral debt was not as easily overlooked. If you'll remember from episode 2, the foreign nations around Israel had proven themselves to be guilty of moral debt specifically, and thus received the kind of punishment by slavery that was not automatically forgiven after 7 years. And this verse in Deuteronomy that I just read to you would also apply to those situations as well. This makes perfect sense if you think about the nature of interest rates and how they function in a society. And it's worth thinking about right now so that you don't confuse what's happening in this Deuteronomy 23 law I just read to you. The whole point of taking out a loan was to borrow money for immediate expenses that were to be paid back in full by a certain timeline. And interest rates tied to different loans are based on the level of risk involved in the possibility that the debtor will be unable to pay back that loan in time. Put more simply, the more likely a debtor is to default, the higher the interest rate is. The more reliable the debtor is to pay off a loan on time, the lower the interest rate is. Risky loans have higher interest charges, and safer loans have lower interest charges. Let me put it in even more simpler terms than that. Loans to those who can be trusted have low interest rates, and loans to those who cannot be trusted have higher interest rates. The reason for this is because the creditor is the one taking on that risk in lending out his capital to the benefit of the debtor. And if the creditor had no confidence that his capital given to this loan would be paid back in full, then he would have no reason to give out the loan in the first place. So, in order to financially compensate creditors for such high-risk loans of their money, they were compensated for taking on this risk. The loan carried an interest rate fee for this borrowed capital that was proportional with the level of risk associated with the loan and the debtor's reputation, aka proportional to the level that one could trust in the debtor. And when a creditor places an exorbitant interest rate fee on a loan to a debtor who has no history of default or any history of being untrustworthy as a reputation, it begins to fall into the category of usury. Now, this verse in Deuteronomy 23 reveals that God wanted Israel to grow as a society, as a nation, built on presumed trust for fellow countrymen that was to the benefit of the Israeli society, because it prohibits charging any interest at all on loans to fellow Israelis. So the benefit to the lender, according to God, was that this zero interest rate loaning practice was to expedite the growth of the nation. The lender would be able to see the growth of the nation of Israel itself. The verse says to practice this form of loaning, so, quote, that the Lord your God may bless you in all that you do in the land that you are entering. But foreigners were not entitled to this level of trust because lenders had no confidence that the foreigners would be invested in the growth of Israel to the same degree that Israelis would be. We've already established that the heathen nations had evil reputations and thus could not be afforded de facto trust to handle capital in a responsible, righteous manner. And so foreigners were not presumed to be trustworthy by Hebrew law, and so it was allowed to charge them commensurate interest on loans in order to compensate lenders for the risk of this investment. And if a foreigner was part of the heathen nations around Israel at this time, then it's already been established in previous episodes that they certainly were guilty of moral debt and were undeserving of Israel's trust, unless or until they were able to prove themselves trustworthy by distinguishing themselves. Please hear me out, listener, when I say that, when I say distinguishing themselves. Not distinguishing themselves ethnically from the Canaanite peoples, but rather distinguishing themselves morally from the Canaanite nations, by adhering to the Hebraic ethical standards placed forth by the Mosaic Code, resulting in being integrated into the nation of Israel, in effect. And if a foreigner could distinguish themselves morally from the heathen nations around Israel, fully integrating into the Israeli society as a fellow countryman, this law of charging interest would no longer apply to them, because trust has been built and earned such that a loan granted to them could be presumed safe and trustworthy to be paid back as an ultimate investment in the growth of Israel itself as a nation. In order to prove this interpretation I'm putting forth to you, a critic might think that I need to show you examples of interest rate charges being dropped from loans that were specifically given to foreigners, but I don't need to show you that kind of example to prove what I'm saying is to be true. Rather, all I need to show is how interest rates were charged on fellow Israelites when they displayed behavior that would remove that presumption of trust, rendering themselves to be treated the same category as a foreigner. All I need to show is examples of ethnic Jews being charged legal interest because they've committed crimes of moral debt. Because these examples would indubitably establish that the distinction between foreigner and Hebrew in the eyes of the law, especially in the eyes of this Deuteronomy 23:10 law, was not, properly speaking, based on ethnic background, but on moral standing. Because there are ample examples of foreigners being integrated into Israel as fellow countrymen, and there are ample examples of Israeli countrymen being charged interest as soon as they reveal themselves to be untrustworthy. Exodus 22 verse 1 says, "If a man steals an ox or a sheep and kills it or sells it, he shall repay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep." And verse 7 says, "If a man gives to his neighbor money or goods to keep safe, and it is stolen from the man's house, then if the thief is found, he shall pay double." Leviticus chapter 6, verse 4 and 5 says, "If he has sinned and has realized his guilt, and will restore what he took by robbery, or what he got by oppression, or the deposit that was committed to him, or the lost thing that he found, or anything about which he has sworn falsely, he shall restore it in full, and shall add a fifth to it, and give it to him to whom it belongs on the day he realizes his guilt." These laws show that when a man swears falsely, Exodus chapter 22 verse 9 says it is a, quote, breach of trust. To break the law, and this breach of trust automatically makes one who is in Israel a person guilty of debt that carries an interest rate, regardless of if that person was ethnically Hebrew or not. As Leviticus chapter 19 verse 34 says, You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself. And with these Bible verses, as well as others like them, we see that while the Bible recognizes the important roles that each echelon of authority has in Israeli society, with their respective rights and responsibilities endowed to them, all the way from masters and kings down to even the servants and slaves, that the principle set forth by the Bible is that justice is due to each one of them equally, without discrimination based on social status or ethnic background, but only with discrimination based on their moral behavior. That is, based on their righteousness, which is what justice is. And that even the unrighteous are themselves protected from excessive punishment being leveled against them for the sole purpose of protecting their divine, image-bearing humanity in the sight of other men. Even though the law discriminates in favor of righteous men, the law still gives favorable protections to the unrighteous criminal from dehumanizing treatment.